Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to look at my presentation on the movie Blade Runner with regards to Los Angeles and movie culture. I'm here right now, currently in the Minecraft version of LA from the movie Blade Runner, which was derived from the book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. Let's get started with the presentation. I just wanted to sort of talk while I, walk around the city of LA and, just briefly, give you a lot of information about the topic. So, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick is a science fiction novel in 1968 that depicts the near future of Earth after its nuclear war. Almost all the animals have been extinct in the world, and it is devastated by nuclear waste. It is also the primary motivation for its film adaptation counterpart, Blade Runner, depicted by Ridley Scott in 1982. Although there are obvious parallels from the book to the film, there are significant differences and changes from the original book. A lot of these elements can be classified to satisfy the Los Angeles genre, which we have been talking about in our lectures. This presentation will analyze to what extent Blade Runner has been transformed into an LA film genre, and also for what purpose, consciously or unconsciously, by the acts of the filmmaker. The three elements that I will be analyzing in the LA genre in Blade Runner are the geography and representation of the film, the themes of race and gender, and then also the debunking or the dystopian tone or theme of the film as well. And I want to show you guys that through these three elements, you can see that this film is actually, in fact, an LA film. And it does have a higher purpose for what it says, not only about our society, but the societies that have passed or the different paradigms that we have lived through. So, just so that I can briefly give you some information or background on what, each one of these elements are and how they play a role in LA films, let's go ahead and just give a brief, sort of introduction of each. Geography and representation are a very large part of a lot of LA films, such as Falling Down and Chinatown, which sort of just, use the surroundings or just the city itself or any area of Los Angeles as another protagonist or another conflict in the story. With Chinatown, just the city itself is a famous, sort of landmark for the protagonist, which represents sort of his life before he entered, the private eye. And you can also see this sort of representation of geography or the land in, oh god, that scared me, in films such as Falling Down as well, because it does show a large extensive portion of the beach, the city, and also a lot of, the minorities and minorities. So also in that film, the land does play a large role because it is him sort of getting from destination A to destination B to reach his daughter for his birthday. So that's one, element of LA film that is very crucial in, the genre. Also very crucial and important is the depiction of race and class, specifically the minorities versus, the majorities or the white class. A lot of films that do represent, themes of race and class that are LA films as well are movies such as Sunset Boulevard and Falling Down and Real Women Have Curves. Sunset Boulevard just shows, sort of, the high class end of the times that have passed. Real Women Have Curves is a sort of a different look at, LA's minorities and shows that it's not all glamour and glitz. And then Falling Down, it just shows, the various minorities in LA that, sort of the protagonist comes across, such as the Koreans, the Hispanics, the homosexual, and then the blue collar, and then the rich as well. So that gives, a lot of, representation of class and race as well. And then the last part, which is very interesting, in a lot of LA films, is either a film debunking or boosting up the image of LA, as it is very obvious now that the film Blade Runner does debunk LA sort of in the form of showing how LA has become or will become a dystopia for everyone, basically, to the point where people are leaving sort of the area, and all that's left is oppression and, bad moral judgment, and then also, just the scum of the earth, for lack of better words. So now that you have sort of, an idea of what those are, let's go briefly into sort of the reasons why I chose those. In an article, which I have right here, written by Steve Carpers, which is titled Subverting the Disaffected City, Cityscapes and Blade Runner, he identifies the city's most prominent geological figures as followed: the beaches, the foothills, the streets of Los Angeles, and the Central Valley. He then also notes that none of these are represented in the film. This analysis by Carper strengthens the debunking myth of Los Angeles' purity, and is one element found in other films, such as I mentioned before, but which all have some level of dystopia or, lack of perfect, which LA loves to, sort of show, but not at the extreme or the imaginative, levels as Blade Runner. Another central concept in the film is a science fiction version of Manifest Destiny, where most of the white population has moved off to other world colonies.
Again, in a golden land of opportunity and adventure.
These other world colonies have attached the best and brightest of Earth's population, leaving behind a shattered economy, the useless contributors to humanity, and those who cannot leave or profit from the removal of competition as well. So, where have I ended up? Let's see. Let's go sort of that way, back to the Nexus. The book refers to those who do not leave Earth as being of lesser intelligence, whereas the film represents those left on the planet as minorities, specifically the Latin and Asian culture. The film does allude to the concept of manifest destiny, but only briefly. Also, to that effect, not many people or groups of people are written in the book at all. One key example that supports this claim on status based on class, not by intelligence, is the overwhelming visuals of crowds inside and outside buildings. This is one of the ways Blade Runner was changed in order to represent Los Angeles's, radical structure, or Los Angeles's racial structure. In David Desser's article, Race, Space, and Class, the Politics of San Francisco Film from Metropolis to Blade Runner, which I have right here, one difference from the book to the film is the representation of class or wealth. In Dick's novel, the representation of this is centralized by those who can afford real animals, because the masses of animals, like I mentioned, were demolished by the destruction of a nuclear war terminus, or World War terminus. In Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, you can see Decker's character explain how the system of purchasing an artificial animal works, and how he, longs for, his sheep who died of tetanus. And also in this chapter, and also in a different chapter, Chapter 4, where we see also, sort of this representation of wealth through animal, buying, when Decker is being bribed by Rachel Rosen to, take the owl and sort of leave, the facility as sort of a form of bribery. In the film, however, class and wealth are presented in different ways, not by their tangible materials like animals, but by what Desser says is opposition of high and low motifs. Evidence to support this claim is that the wealthy in the film can escape life on the surface. Elton Tyrell, head of the Tyrell Corporation and the creator of the Andes, which is the term for androids in the book, he lives high above in the city in a pyramid. Even the protagonist, Red Decker, who is a Blade Runner, lives 92 stories above the city. And also to that effect, the police or the corrupted authority spend most of their time in hovercrafts looking down at the city. So there is a lot of, sort of visuals in, the protagonist and also in other characters that show that those who live higher up and away from the, the surface have, sort of more wealth and more power in, the story sense, but also, in the society that has been depicted in Blade Runner. In Judith B. Kerman's article, Politics in Blade Runner Dystopia, she brings back to light the various elements that Carper addresses in its article as dystopian in Los Angeles, such as the constant rain and darkness, towers and city canyons. Oops. Need to eat. Where was I? Oh, yeah, such as the constant rain and darkness, the towers, and the city canyons that have replaced the suburban areas, and the pollution and dirt around, just sort of the feel. If you look around, it's sort of dark and gloomy. It's not sunshine and lovely like in a lot of boostering films that LA depicts, such as Clueless. I wanted to mention that although this isn't one of the traditional senses of glorifying Los Angeles, it is still an LA film because it still talks about the system and talks about what might happen and where we might tread if we don't consider our actions in the current and in the past world. So in all sense, I feel like it's just look through the history or you're doomed to repeat it through the forms of racism, discrimination, and then also chaos and unorder. Upon looking at these compelling arguments that say that the filmmakers' attempt to represent Blade Runner in the Los Angeles genre was way over their heads, I would argue otherwise. Some would say that the film is more of a representation of New York, which is often personified as the central nervous system of the country's academia, but also a hellish dystopia that pushes the middle class outward and leaves the poor in the grasp of the rich. Carper in his article emphasized one quote from an interview that the filmmakers were trying to create a representation that had passed 40 years and of the upcoming 40 years. In Kerman's article, she quotes from one of the writers of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep in an interview talking about the film. If the future is one you can see and touch, it makes you a little bit uneasier because you'll feel it around the corner. With both, I feel they emphasize more about times that aren't represented now or in the contemporary time in which the film was made, and I feel it should be more important to look at the film's era at the time at which it was being created. So some of the things that the world was going, or just the nation in general, were going through during or as this film was being created was a post-World War era, a neo-Nazi era as well. So I believe that the film is not looking to the past or looking into the future, more so that it's looking into the presence into which the film was made. The film represents race in such a way that we would see ludicrous among our mass populations, even though to some extent discrimination and racism are all still being represented in our current time. It just isn't as open or predominantly important issue in our era. So I feel like the film, to conclude, is an LA film because of those three aspects that I mentioned, such as race, geography, and just because it lacks something does not mean that it's not representing something. In fact, I feel like the film is sort of a warning in its own cheesy but fun way of what our country was going through as far as, racism and just the world in general. But then I felt it was a appropriate use of sort of a platform to bring to eyes people's attention about how we treat people, especially in Los Angeles, and where it might lead just the security of humanity, the security of our world itself. It's sort of cheesy, I know, but in my conclusion, I do believe that Blade Runner is an LA film, not just because it was set in Los Angeles, but because it wants to so much to give a message to everyone who reads or watches the book. So that's sort of the conclusion I came up towards, and thanks to the help of all the sources, which I will be listing right now, I hope you had an amazing, time just looking at the scenery or just listening to my presentation, and hopefully this sheds some light on Blade Runner as, a very interesting but very important film in our culture. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.